When I cleared out the settee, I wanted to leave the area above the waterline alone, as I was just looking for corrosion damage that would make it necessary for parts of the hull to be replaced, and it was unlikely that I'd find any damage of that kind above the waterline. If I did find some anyway, it could still be fixed while Ophelia was afloat, so it wouldn't really affect the timeline or the other jobs that will need to be done when Ophelia gets on the hard. Since then though, a few pieces of the puzzle may have fallen in place, and now I'd really like to see what the inside of Ophelia's hull looks like above the waterline, so the liner has to go. With the liner out of the way, it becomes quite clear that my hopes of the water damage being restricted to the lower part of the hull has turned out to be reality. Further down, the metallized paper was brownish and the two layers had separated. In this area though, the paper is pristine and what can be seen of the foam looks perfectly fine. Also, it was possible to actually get most of the screws out in the intended way, something which wasn't possible lower down in the hull. So most of the dust is now settled. I don't know exactly how visible it is on screen, but if you're here watching it with your own two eyes, then you can see that there's some odd behavior here. Because we have dents in the hull. And here's a big one that's pointed inwards. And here you have one that goes outwards. And here it goes up and then a bit down and then up again. So, yeah, and here you have the same thing. But the rips themselves seem just fine. They don't seem to have moved whatsoever. The welds are intact. They haven't cracked. So, yeah, it's not because the entire side of the boat has been hammered or something. That's not the issue here. But I think I know what's going on. When I bought Ophelia, I noticed that she had some fairly visible dents along both sides, particularly in the area around her beam. There weren't any dents of significance on the bow or stern parts of the hull, and none in visible spots at any rate. I thought that Ophelia might have kissed the neighbors a bit too hard in stormy weather and considered fixing the dents with a hammer and a block of wood. I was informed, though, probably by the engineer, if I remember correctly, that it would likely be quite difficult, bordering on the impossible, to repair dents in double-curved 6mm steel in that way. Which made me ask myself, exactly just how hard did Ophelia hit something, and on both sides no less, for those dents to appear? After the first video was posted, I was contacted by one of the previous owners who told me a bit about Ophelia's past, and he mentioned that Ophelia could feel a bit, well, the word was soft in rough seas. That comment got me thinking, because even though steel hulls are able to flex slightly, it should be almost imperceivable. After having torn out the starboard settee, gaining access to the hidden structure in the hull, I looked at the paper version of the drawing I've been using to point out where on the boat I was working, and then it hit me. Those dents aren't from collisions. They're deformations from the hull flexing. It seems that I've been slightly damaged from studying classical mechanics, and I see levers and pivot points in everything. I think that Ophelia, as she is now, may have a construction error, one that may either have been a birth defect of sorts, or have been introduced at a later point, likely when she was rebuilt in Gibraltar. Although there are plenty of vertical load-bearing parts in Ophelia, there are very few, if any, longitudinal ones above the keel, and the hull is actually fairly flat in places once you get up above the waterline. The aft section is constructed of fairly flat pieces, but it's supported internally by the cockpit and externally by the coaming, so the entire aft structure is likely very stiff. Now, that long flattish aft, which reaches out quite far beyond the keel, if that's pressured upwards by a wave, the only thing that can absorb those forces and lift the entire boat, rather than cause the cockpit area to bend upwards and towards the center of the boat, is either the hull or the deck. The deck, though, is fairly thin, 4mm of steel, and there are no crosslinks that could help, and even if there were, those forces would be compression forces, which thin metal is famously poor at handling. The house doesn't extend very far down the length of the boat, so that doesn't help much. The forces can't go downwards, as the double curve is quite pronounced near the very rigid keel construction, and the stern is double curved with a very pronounced curve, so it's unlikely to be able to flex much. That leaves just the hull in the midships area, which is fairly flat, and seeing that Ophelia's ribs aren't connected with stringers, they're free to move towards one another, if the forces are large enough to cause the steel between them to flex and possibly bend. Usually, that motion will likely be an elastic deformation, where everything falls back in place afterwards. But if pushed hard enough, the steel may deform plastically and then retain its new shape, leaving permanent dents and bulges. I don't think that this has always been the case, though. Ophelia may have had a different deck construction when she was built. Her sister, the Safari, has a wooden deck with all the longitudinal beams and cross bracing that entails, and Ophelia may have had something similar before the fire in Greece in '69. The fire may also have weakened the steel above the waterline a bit, where the part below the waterline would have been kept cool by the water on the outside. The steel further up would just be air cooled on the outside, so that may have gotten pretty hot. If you look at the hull up here, you can see that there's very, very little curvature to the plates, well, the steel plates. It's barely curved. Down here you have a clear curve, and it's actually double curved ever so slightly. It bends a bit this way and this way, but this piece up here bends only that way, and that's so slight that it hardly matters. So for all intents and purposes, the hull from up here is just flat. I hope you enjoy these videos, and I'd like to hear any feedback you might have in the comments. If you feel like supporting the creation of these videos and the restoration of Ophelia, you can do so on my Patreon or by signing up as a member of this channel. Either way, thank you for your interest in my project. So, what will I do about this? Sailing around in a boat that flexes so bad that it causes dents in the hull is hardly acceptable. Well, first off, I'll try to straighten out the dents, and seeing that using a hammer and a block of wood seems to have been ruled out, I'm considering using a hydraulic piston to provide the needed force. So now I just need to figure out how to anchor that piston, but I think that could be done by hooking into Ophelia's ribs, because they seem quite solid and haven't been moved out of the way. Once the dents are fixed, I need to figure out how to provide the needed stiffness to prevent the issue from occurring once again. I could install stringers or something akin to a shear strake where the hull meets the deck. Both would provide longitudinal stiffness, but would also require quite large pieces of material that would need to be shaped to follow Ophelia's curves. Not exactly an easy task, so I think I'm going to do something completely different. I think I'm going to create something akin to a geodetic lattice structure, welded to the hull and incorporating the existing ribs. This can be done one small piece at a time and should provide a lot of strength compared to the weight it will add. Geodetic lattice structures were used in aircraft during World War II because they're both light and strong and reduce the strength requirements of the plane's skin, and that would be the hull in this case. So it will also lessen the impact of any hull corrosion as long as the hull just doesn't rust through. A geodetic lattice would also provide some additional torsional stiffness, which, although probably not needed, wouldn't hurt. The forces on a sailboat are quite significant, and Ophelia, well, she isn't exactly lightweight, so that rig is gonna push her pretty hard and generate some quite significant forces. So the lattice I construct here would be equilateral triangles spanning this space in the back, back and forth here, and then, well, matching triangles over here. So the entire wall would be covered in triangles, and the sides wouldn't need to be quite this tall. I could get about away with probably 2 centimeters or something like that. That would reinforce this quite significantly. Then I just need to figure out, well, of course I'll need to start way up here, just below the deck. And then how far down do we go? Yeah, excuse the mess. All the way down, or just stop somewhere around here, because I'm pretty sure that the bulges stop at this level. So I might just need to reinforce from up here to down here. That should be enough to stiffen the hull quite significantly. Yeah. While I was editing this video and looking through all the different segments I recorded again and again, another thought struck me. Maybe the forces that causes all these dents and bulges didn't just come from the waves lifting the stern, because it just seemed that there couldn't be enough force to do what had been done to the entire hull. It seems that there had to be more at play here. And maybe I think that the forces from the wind on the rig also played a major part. See, you have the stays that keep the mast upright. They go from the deck and up to the top of the mast in a triangle. And when the force from the wind pushes on the mast and the sails, well, that's like pulling the top of the triangle. It would usually try to move towards the center of the boat, but the ribs and the anchoring to the deck prevent that. And that means that the bottom corners of the triangle try to push together. The force will create, well, a compression force between the stays. And that matches quite well with some of the dents and bulges I see on the hull. It can't be the whole story though, because there are only two sets either side of stays, one for the headmast and one from the mizzenmast. And I also see dents and bulges between these two sets of stays. And well, compression between the stays can't create compression between the sets of stays. That just doesn't work. So something else has to be at play. And I'm thinking that maybe we have a situation where the entire hull is pre-stressed by the stays. That's quite a lot of force there. And then you add in the force from the stern being lifted by waves and, well, not being supported enough. And that might cause the dents and bulges when you add these forces together, because they tend to point in the same direction. I also noticed that the bow of the boat seems to be quite wavy. I hadn't noticed that before. And, well, that could be explained by the head stay pulling upwards, because an upwards pull at the front of the boat will cause a compression along the side of the bow, which could result in the kind of waviness that I'm seeing if the bow itself isn't stiff enough on the inside. Either way though, the cure for these issues remain the same. That would be to add some stiffness to the inside of the hull, and a geodetic lattice welded on the inside of Opelia's hull seems like a good way to add this strength. As I showed you, I intend to create this lattice by, well, cutting ordinary flat bar stock into pieces and welding the pieces in between the ribs so that each rib is one side of the equilateral triangle, and then the point that points away from the rib will touch the next rib, and then you have a triangle pointing the other way just below that, and then you go all the way down. That will create a mesh alongside the inside of the hull. And I think that maybe I would be able to get away with welding this and not ruining the paint job, because the hull is quite thick and should be able to absorb the heat. I'm not sure I have the nerve to test this though, so probably I'm going to start this welding job before I get Opelia sandblasted and repainted, but while she's on the hard. I wouldn't want to mess around with stuff that could punch a hole in her hull while she's in the water, even when I'm working above the waterline. I'd rather not do that. So now I just need to find a way to cut and weld a gazillion pieces of bar stock without going crazy, and, well, maybe learn to weld. So the question now becomes, what's up next? Should I do what I did here in the starboard side and the port side as well? Because it looks like the dents and bulges are quite similar, if not exactly symmetrical. So I'm going to find exactly the same thing with the hull here. You can see that from the outside. But I could also start getting rid of this last cupboard and then move on to the head. There's not going to be a lot of space to work with in there, and then we have the rebirth after that. But could also rip this out and check here, because there seems to be quite a few dents and bulges in that area on the outside as well. But yeah, decisions. That one, or that one, or maybe something completely different and yet similar to this.